video today, I'm going to be talking about why behavioural modification therapies did not work in reducing my rage attacks caused by Tourette syndrome, PANS and PANDAS. So by behavioural modification therapy, I mean things like reward charts, discipline, and the traffic light system, which I will explain more in depth later on. These were interventions put in place by psychologists and psychiatrists in an attempt to reduce my rage attacks and oppositional defiance traits. The problem is, they didn't work because it was treating it as if it was bad behaviour, as if it was a choice rather than a symptom, but it was a symptom of a medical condition that needed to be managed. So when I was around 10 years old, I was seeing a psychologist. They mainly did cognitive behavioural therapy for my OCD, but they also did like a traffic light system thing where some of it was good. It was like there was a green zone with good behaviours, yellow zone with behaviours which should be ignored, which I actually appreciated because for some of them, I think they included things that they suspected weren't really in my control and put it in that area. And then the red was stuff that you'd have a consequence for, which may sound like a really good plan and a really good idea, but the problem is that literally everything on that, traffic light was involuntary. Almost everything on there was. So it kind of defeated the object because it implied that I could control it and that I would just have to keep myself in the green zone. But when I couldn't control certain things that were in the red zone, nothing can really stop you from something you can't control. Sadly, willpower is not going to stop rage attacks, which are neurological storms. And there were many signs that my rage attacks weren't really like bad behaviour, they weren't a behavioural problem, but they weren't really taken very seriously because it's such a misunderstood symptom and it is sadly usually treated like a kid's just naughty. In fact, on a poll I did asking about misdiagnoses that people have gotten when they actually have PANS PANDAS, 60% of people said they were misdiagnosed with bad behaviour, which is absolutely terrible because it is an autoimmune brain condition in most cases. So, it's very upsetting to realise how common it is to be misdiagnosed and just seen as naughty. But in reality, as I said, there were signs that my rage attacks weren't just being naughty. For example, sometimes my memory of what happened in a rage attack would be kind of hazy. And in a rage attack, I would completely lose control of my rational thinking and actions. Like, it really wasn't me in a way. And then I'd feel really remorseful and confused afterwards. Whereas if a kid was doing that intentionally, that wouldn't really happen. And also, I would often sort of zone out once the rage attack had ended and just stare into space, being completely unresponsive to things. And again, that isn't really a typical thing to do. That's clearly not bad behaviour. It was something neurological because my brain was just suddenly trying to calm down. As well as this, during a rage attack, my sensory regulation was terrible. Like, everything would feel bright. Like, there's so much contrast because of the amount of adrenaline going through me. And again, if something's intentional, you're unlikely to have that much adrenaline going through you to the point where you have this such intense sensory overload. Again, that was a neurological symptom, the sensory overload, the sensory processing issues. Sadly, no amount of self-control would have stopped any of this. If it did, then I obviously wouldn't do it because, my psychiatrists weren't very understanding. My parents were always amazing, but the psychiatrists, they weren't very good because, they threatened to put me in a care home for my rage attacks and I had separation anxiety. So that scared me a lot, and obviously if I could have stopped them, then I would, but I couldn't because they were caused as a neurological symptom. In PANDAS and PANS, the rage attacks often go away when a person receives antibiotics or intravenous immunoglobulin because the rage attacks are actually caused by the immune system attacking the brain, involuntary. And in Tourette syndrome, the rage attacks are actually similar to the tics. They're not tics, but in my experience, they are just as involuntary as tics. It's a complete loss of emotional regulation and rational thinking that, it's just not bad behaviour. And I think the fact that it occurs in around 40% of people with Tourette's, possibly more, shows that it is a symptom. Like, people with Tourette aren't doing this on purpose. The problem with the behavioural modification therapy thing was that it never got to the root. It didn't recognise that it was neurological. It would just say things like, don't do this, which is really unhelpful because, that's exactly the same as saying to someone, don't tic, don't have a seizure, don't have a episode of elevated heart rate. There's symptoms that you can't control. Nobody chooses to have rage attacks, and that's why people feel such intense guilt and shame afterwards. if they could control it, they wouldn't do it, because nobody wants to feel that way, and nobody wants to feel like they're hurting the people around them. Even if an individual seems unsympathetic, they actually probably are. They probably do feel bad about it, but of course they can't control it, so that doesn't mean it stops, because no matter how bad you feel about something, if it's involuntary, it's not going to stop. And these behavioural modification things, like the reward charts, weren't very helpful, because I had them for months and they never had any effect whatsoever, because it would be like, if you don't have a rage attack, you'll get a sticker. But that was useless, because that's exactly the same as saying, if you don't tick, you'll get a sticker. I'm going to tick regardless, because it's involuntary, so it's the same with rage attacks. And it was like, if you have a rage attack, the sticker will get crossed out. You won't have it anymore. And again, that didn't do anything. I would have these involuntary attacks. Stickers would get crossed out. But even if I felt bad about it, nothing would change, because it was uncontrollable. And this is something that a lot of doctors don't seem to understand. Sadly, they do treat a lot of kids with Tourette's and PANDAS, and autistic kids who have meltdowns as naughty, when, you know, it couldn't be further from the truth. These kids are just misunderstood and need support. You know, so the behavioural modification genuinely didn't work, and it doesn't make any sense as well to just say to a child, you know, that's bad, don't do that, because I think it's pretty common sense that things like hitting out and kicking and yelling are bad, or like not healthy behaviours, but that doesn't mean that they can control them. If they wanted to help, then they should have taught management strategies, taught relaxation where possible, taught ways to redirect things where possible, rather than just saying, don't do that, it's inappropriate, because we know it's inappropriate, but we can't control it, so that doesn't stop it. But that's really what they missed. It was always like, if you do this, this will happen. But there was no help as such with emotional regulation or anything. It was just the assumption that if I wanted to, I could control it, which isn't true at all. But yeah, that behavioural modification, I would say, is not the way to manage rage attacks in PANDAS and PANS, because as I said, the rage attacks in PANDAS and PANS often go away when the brain inflammation is treated. So the important thing is treat the brain inflammation by whatever means necessary. For some people with PANS PANDAS, that will mean antibiotics. For some people, it will mean medication that reduces inflammation. For some, it will be IVIG. For some, it will be looking for underlying infections like Lyme and Bartonella and then treating those. For some, it will be figuring out if there's food sensitivities triggering inflammation and then eliminating them if they are, because just like infections can trigger inflammation, so can certain food sensitivities and allergies as well, which is something that a lot of people don't realise, but that needs to be looked into as well. So with the behavioural modification, it never got to the cause either. Like, all these triggers, it never got to the cause of them, and two of my biggest triggers personally were food dye sensitivity. There's a lot of evidence now showing that food dye sensitivity can trigger hyperactivity and anger and aggression. There was a brain scan done by Amen Clinics on a teenage boy who would become aggressive after consumption of red dye 40, and the SPECT scan actually did show a difference in brain activity, like a overstimulated brain activity after the consumption of it, which was triggering the violence and the anger. That happens sadly in a lot of people who are neurodivergent, whether they have ADHD, Tourette's, autism, PANS, PANDAS. Sadly, it's quite common in the neurodivergent community. I would highly recommend reading studies on that, the link between food dyes and triggering these kind of symptoms, because that's common in neurodivergent people. And also another trigger for me was tic suppression, which was super frustrating, because some psychologists and doctors act like if you suppress your tics and just learn to deal with it and learn to suppress, then everything will be fine. But that was never ever the case for me, because tic suppression would always lead to a rebound. And again, a lot of psychologists say, oh, the rebound doesn't exist, but that's not true, because myself and pretty much everyone else with Tourette's and tics that I know do experience some kind of rebound effect from suppressing later on in the day. Like, if I would suppress all day for this little volunteer thing that I was doing when I was 18, in the evenings I would have a horrendous tic attack, and as soon as I stopped that and stopped suppressing, I wouldn't have a horrendous tic attack. So it was pretty obvious correlation there. And it was the same with rage attacks, and I could tell because the predominatory urge would build up and up and up and up and up throughout the day. The predominatory urge is a sensation that is extremely uncomfortable and physically intolerable, that often comes before a tic, but if we hold the tic in, it only grows and gets stronger. Sadly, you don't always get used to it, like people say you will, you don't. It would just explode out as involuntary rage attacks, which I'd then get punished and blamed for, especially by psychiatrists, so you couldn't really win. So it helped me to just say, you know, I'm not going to suppress tics, I'm going to tic freely, because my body needs to do this. It's better if I tic freely now than pay for it later by, you know, exploding into a rage attack. So behavioural modification didn't work because it didn't get to the triggers, and it kind of just assumed that if I wanted to control it, I would, and that with enough positive reinforcement, like a dog, I would get better. Didn't work. Or with enough discipline, like a dog, I would get better. Again, it didn't work at all. As well as this, the behavioural modification does not address sensory needs in the slightest. A lot of people do have sensory processing needs, and like things like sound sensitivity and light sensitivity and overstimulation will trigger things like meltdowns and rages in some people, and that was not taken into consideration at all, because again, it was just assumed that with enough reinforcement you could control it, and it doesn't work like that if the trigger is never addressed. So you need to look at the triggers, you need to look at what regulates a person's nervous system instead of assuming that they can control it. If there are any parents out there who have a child dealing with this, it's obviously very, very difficult because, you know, rage attacks and meltdowns can be very violent. You know, I would throw things, I would draw on walls, I would hit people, throw chairs, scream, swear, scratch people. It was a lot, but it was never really within my control. It wasn't me, it was involuntary. It was completely different from my usual personality. Like, I went pretty much overnight from a very sweet little girl to someone who was struggling with defiance, rages, severe OCD, tics, all that stuff. And despite the fact that it looked like bad behaviour, it went a lot deeper. It was brain inflammation and neurologically misfired signals, and it needed to be addressed as such. So although I know that it's terrifying, it is really important to be as patient with the child as possible, and, you know, let them know that this isn't really who they are, and you still care about them, you still love them, and you know that you'll work through this together and you'll find answers. Again, sometimes easier said than done, but you can find answers. It can just take some time learning the unique triggers for the individual and being patient and helping them feel regulated rather than shaming them for something they can't control.